we should not just look at the US-China trade relationship. It's a bit misleading. And what we see for the moment is US and China partially decoupling, but China coupling more with Southeast Asia and US coupling more with EU.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. I caught up with my guest today, Pascal Lamy, on the sidelines of the World Trade Organization's public forum. Pascal Lamy is a former Director General of the WTO and current Vice Chair of the Paris Peace Forum. He has a reputation as a big thinker, particularly on geopolitical matters. So in our conversation, we discuss some of the contours of the deepening rivalry between China and the United States on trade issues. There is an emerging trend in geopolitics of decoupling, which is the idea that the world may be split into two trading blocs, one led by China, the other by the United States. I kick off by asking Pascal Lamy if he believes that decoupling is inevitable at this point. We then discuss some of the roots, the causes, and impact of trade rivalries between the United States and China, as well as the role of the European Union, and how the rest of the world, that is not the US, China, or Europe, can influence debates around international trade. If you are listening to this contemporaneously, this is the last episode we're publishing before UNGA Week in New York. I will be in New York covering UNGA from all angles and then some. Expect great content here on Global Dispatches, as well as on our new sister show, To Save Us From Hell, which is a podcast about the United Nations co-hosted by me and Anjali Dayal, an academic who specializes in the United Nations. To Save Us From Hell has been going for about 6 weeks at this point, and I'm really excited for what we have in store in terms of our coverage of UNGA, both here on Global Dispatches and on our sister podcast. You can access it all by going to globaldispatches.org. And while you're there, you can support the show with a paying subscription. I appreciate it. All right, now here is my conversation with Pascal Lamy, former Director General of the World Trade Organization and Vice Chair of the Paris Peace Forum. Monsieur Lamy, thank you so much for speaking with me here in a very busy public forum. I know your time is valuable, so I'll jump right into it.
My pleasure.
Kind of a big picture question about decoupling with you. Do you believe that decoupling is inevitable between the United States and China at this point?
I believe, as far as US and China are concerned, that there already is a degree of decoupling. But I don't think, even if I believe the US themselves believe they could decouple from China, I believe this is not the case. The two economies are too entangled into one another within a context of globalization, which with ups and downs will remain, although I believe that in a number of specific products, goods, or services, both sides, for reasons of national security, because they feel vulnerable to each other, whereas this was not the case or less the case previously. So they will want to deplug the value chain that binds them in a number of security-sensitive areas. And this is about goods, and this is about services, mostly, I believe, on the frontier of tech. But I don't think it's going to be the case for TV sets or bicycles or refrigerators, which are basic, bottom line, cheap goods that benefit from globalization.
The U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has a term he likes to use in regards to the export controls on advanced chip and chip manufacturing, a small yard and a high fence. How do you approach that question, that formulation?
I think he's a very clever guy, and he gave a very simple narrative and concept that in reality can mean anything, because it depends on the size of the fence and depends on the size of the yard. And small yard, big fence, says something, but allows for a lot of interpretation as you adjust. But I think it's a very clever sketch of what the US want to do. And of course, we know that depending on the president, depending on the administration, depending on the degree of geopolitical tensions between China and US, and notably Taiwan, this is a sort of variable geometry. But whatever variable it is, I think there's a layer of basic value chain multi-localization between China and US that will not change. Although, and we can see that already, we should not just look at the US-China trade relationship. It's a bit misleading. And what we see for the moment is US and China partially decoupling, but China coupling more with Southeast Asia and US coupling more with EU. So there's a bit of bilateral decoupling, but there is a lot of regional recoupling that is happening in the same time.
One of the kind of recurring themes here at the public forum, and something you just articulated, is that like the economic logic of integration remains strong and against decoupling, against fragmentation remains strong. But I'm interested in getting your perspective as a European, as a non-American, of why it is that you feel that while the economic arguments against decoupling, against fragmentation are strong, the political momentum is towards more protectionism.
Well, I've always thought and said that globalization was efficient and painful. That it was efficient because it was painful, and it was painful because it was efficient. In that, to put it very simply, multi-localization of production systems allows you to locate your production in a cheaper place. That process leads to a more efficient allocation of production factors, capital, labor, of course, according to a sort of Ricardo Schumpeterian model. If I do something better than you do, and you do something better than I do, our rational interest is to exchange. But Schumpeter tells us that this will lead to a reshuffling of competition parameters, and those on my side who less well than what you do and the other way around won't be happy. So we've always had a tension between efficiency and root politics of trade. That was even in the many sort of happier years of globalization. And by the way, this is what differentiates the EU and US. The EU knows that and has a relatively thick social insecurity reduction buffer, which the US do not have, which is why globalization, in a way, had a better political support in EU than in the US. Now, that was the previous period. This does not change. What has changed is that on top of the social resentment against the painfulness of globalization, which is the flip side of it being efficient, we now have a security component. So we have the usual social problem, and then we have a security component. This is the new thing. And this is the moment where geopolitics took the upper hand over geoeconomics, which is why we are in a different sort of globalization. This is the case, and we all know that if globalization is efficient and painful, deglobalization is inefficient and painful, because you will lose the benefit of the efficiencies which you created for the price of the pain of reshuffling production systems, but you will lead to less efficiencies. And who will pay? Lower efficiencies, which translate into prices, are less rich consumers. They are the ones for whom the price matters most because they have a limited amount to spend every month. So I think this is where we are for the moment. The costs of deglobalization or decoupling or fragmentation, and again, I'm not saying it's happening everywhere all the time and in a big way, but the costs will have to be paid. And I think this is not yet enough on the radar screen.
So one of the sort of oddities of the moment, and you just sort of alluded to it, is that, in Western countries, in wealthier countries, globalization and free trade is politically a little more sensitive, and we're trending in one direction, whereas in much of the rest of the world, in the developing world in particular, there is much more enthusiasm for more robust and free trade. It's an odd thing to view. I'm interested in learning from you. We often discuss trade through the lens of Europe, China, and the US, but what about the rest, right? What about the middle economies, the middle powers? And they not need be passive observers here. So how can they influence debates?
I think your picture is right. On this planet, if I was to do a poll of are you in favor or against globalization, the result would probably 80-20. And the 80 being on the side of people who still believe that tomorrow will be better for them than yesterday. And the problem with the 20% on the other side is that most of them now have, right or wrong, the perception that tomorrow is going to be worse than yesterday. And that's, I think, the big dividing line. Of course, the balance of forces which you described and which I described does not translate properly in international politics. And that comes from the fact that the system, the way it was organized with the UN, with these different international organizations, still is very much framed by those who framed it at the end of the Second World War. And there is an obvious imbalance in power, in representation, in influence, which I think is one of the main problems we have to face. It's not the case in an organization like the WTO, which from the very beginning was sort of based on consensus, and the African group has much more clout in the WTO than in the IMF or in the World Bank. So there we have a very serious problem, and the reality is that they are not properly organized to use this relative balance which is in their favor. And the reason why they are not well organized is that a lot of their diplomatic system, a lot of the software of their diplomatic system is still the North is the colonial power, and our main problem is rebalancing the political post-colonial, maybe in the future climate tension, whereas trade issues do not play enough of a role. And that's why I've very often been advising developing countries, emerging countries, to do what Brazil has done for a long time, which is to have foreign affairs and trade in the same hands, so that you don't have foreign affairs that does the diplomacy and trade that does the technical stuff, because the technical stuff at the end of the day is what matters much more for the end of the month of your constituencies. And this is an issue which I think emerging countries have not yet properly been grasping with.
So there really, in your view, needs to be almost structural changes in how many of these developing countries organize their foreign policy bureaucracies in order to maximize their ability to have leverage at entities like the WTO in order to push back against the fights between the big powers and the trend against decoupling. Earlier today, I spoke to the chief economist here at the WTO, Ralph Osa, who articulated the deleterious impacts of decoupling on the developing world in particular. And that's why I'm just very interested in learning how the developing world, emerging economies can push back.
I mean, I think it's a very good example. It's one thing for the chief economic of WTO to say, as an economist, which is absolutely obvious for any economist, that protectionism is bad for developing countries and worse for them than for richer countries. It's another thing to translate this into a posture, into a political position on which India, Brazil, China probably now is more on the side of an industrialized country, Indonesia, Egypt, South Africa, Vietnam, and the like, could coalesce. And the reason why they are not doing it is A, because, again, I think they are not well organized structurally to do that. It's also that there are differences. I mean, the stance of Brazil or Indonesia or India on most of these issues is a different one. India is a country whose DNA vis-à-vis economic and trade respiration with the rest of the world is more protective than others. And by the way, we see that in the WTO. So the economic truth is what the chief economists of WTO and the OECD and the IMF and the World Bank and whoever will say. That's not today properly incarnated into political postures on their side.
I wanted to ask you a few questions about trade and climate. I know that climate is something that you are seized with these days and is a top priority for you in your professional work these days. So I have a kind of a specific question on electronic vehicles, tariffs, and climate. So earlier this year, the Biden administration enacted about a 40% tariff on EVs from China, essentially locking them out of the American market. Meanwhile, the European Commission is looking to do something very similar, alleging that Chinese EV companies receive unfair government subsidies. How do you approach this question? As we speak, the Spanish prime minister is in China where he called into question the wisdom of these potential tariffs on EVs. Is he right?
Two things. First, we all have a problem with China EVs overcapacity. The reality is that for the last 15 years, China has been building with a lot of public capital at national level, at regional level, at municipal level, a vast capacity of producing up to the art, very good EVs. And relatively cheaper than what both US and EU
EVs
can do it.
in the US are still like a luxury car,
Okay, for the moment. So we now have that. They have a huge overcapacity, so they have to export. And they have to export in a way, and they do it in a way that de facto subsidizes exports because of the huge cost of capital which China Inc. has invested in this area. So that's a reality. Second, US and EU do not do it the same way. US put a tariff sitting on whatever WTO rule there is, because the US commitment in WTO is not a 40% tariff on cars. So the US do that knowing that they totally breach WTO rules. It's a habit that was taken by Trump, and unfortunately, Biden has pursued. EU does it according to WTO rules. There is an agreement in WTO. Anti-subsidy duties can be levied if you prove the demonstration that there is a harming subsidization on the other side. So that's the difference. And by the way, as you see, the EU is adjusting. It's a system which is on company per company, not like the US, which is erga omnes. The US put a tariff against whatever Chinese company wants to export. The EU puts a different anti-subsidy duty depending on how much subsidies company A or Y or B got. So it's a very different ballgame. Now, as far as the Spanish Prime Minister is concerned, in the EU system, Spain will have the occasion to vent its position when this will go to a committee of member states, which will vote on whether or not what the EU Commission proposes will be enforced. So it's a very different system. I recognize that seen from distance, Korea, Japan, EU, US, Turkey are behaving the same way, protectionist against EV. When you look at how it works, and of course, the big difference is whether you do it according to international trade rules or not. And that's something that matters. And as a European, I'm still in favor of the EU behaving according to WTO trade rules, because I probably believe that open trade is more crucial for EU than it is for the US.
So I do take your point about like the mechanisms in which they are seeking to impose tariffs or imposing tariffs in the United States versus how Europe is approaching it matters. Like how they do it matters, and whether or not they bind themselves to the multilateral agreements to which they've previously agreed. I understand intuitively that it matters. I'm a multilateralist myself, but big picture, what do you see of the implications to climate change in a more fragmented and decoupled world? I mean, you could imagine a world in which the US, China, and Europe all work together to produce clean energy, but that's not happening. So if we are indeed moving towards a more decoupled, a more fragmented world, how do you see the implications for our common efforts against climate change?
This is not a malediction. They all work to make their economies greener, more climate friendly, less biodiversity negative, but they don't do it together. That's the reality. And this reality stems from the way the Paris Agreement 10 years ago was arranged. It was not arranged like traditional international agreements with multilaterally determined contributions, like it is in the WTO. In the WTO, who pays what in terms of trade opening for the price of others doing it is multilaterally determined. It's the result of a multilateral negotiation where they all have to agree at the end of the day, which, by the way, is why it's difficult. The Paris Agreement evaded this difficulty with nationally determined contributions, which is a much more flexible system. I'm not saying it's a bad system, because it creates quite a bit of a domestic accountability, which might not be there in the previous system. And we can see that with courts, for instance, accepting to criticize governments for not doing what they said they would do. So I'm not saying it's not efficient, but it creates a mess. And it creates a mess on the trade side, because the moment you impose to your economy new green requirements, for instance, carbon pricing, or measuring the carbon footprint, or a regulation that we say this is good because it's carbon light and this is bad because this is carbon heavy, we do it in so different ways that there is a traffic jam on the trade side. That's the reality. How much of this traffic jam is a problem for the trade system? It certainly is one. This is probably not the major problem. The major problem is how much is this traffic jam a problem for climate and biodiversity issues? And I happen to believe that it is starting to act as a brake on an issue where instead of having a brake, we should have an accelerator, because we obviously are not where we should be if we want to, let's say, relatively clean the planet by the end of this century with a signpost in 2050. So this climate trade, let's say environment trade nexus, is not properly governed at global level. I'm among those who say the WTO should step in. The WTO has a mandate for that because of its charter, which dates from 1994. There is a Trade and Environment Committee in the WTO. Some say, oh, no, this is not. India says, no. WTO is about trade, not about environment. So discussing environment in WTO is going to lead to green protectionism. No, what they do not say is, okay, so what? Where should this be discussed? Should it be discussed in the COPs? I attend COPs. I'm among those who tried to generate a trade and environment discussion. And most of the people in the COPs, and I was in Sharm el-Sheikh and I was in Dubai, say, oh, no, we are about environment. This is trade. So we have this problem, and I think, and I've been working a lot with the Institut Jacques Delors in Brussels, and I'm a VP of the board of this third Institut Jacques Delors after Paris and Berlin. We've been publishing a lot and proposing that WTO acts as a comparability forum of environment-related trade measures. They should be notified, they should be discussed, and at some stage, the WTO Secretariat and the members should work to find some sort of equivalence. There has to be a leveling the playing field process. Otherwise, these worlds of trade and climate will remain clustered, and this will slow. At the end of the day, decarbonation, again, I think we all know, and I'm chairing the Climate Overshoot Commission, which is one of these old monkeys, wise people, big global body. I mean, it's obvious that we have to accelerate.
So that's interesting.
Slow.
So just lastly, just to emphasize this, there is a lack of governance on the relationship between environmental issues and trade, and you see the WTO as a potential
Absolutely.
platform to advance some of these conversations.
And I think it's the WTO for two reasons. First, everybody is around the table. B, WTO is not a place where there is a North-South imbalance, like in the IMF or like in the OECD. And third, they have the expertise. The Secretariat of WTO today, if you look at a place where there is an expertise on these issues, and it's usually technical and difficult at some stage, they have a very good team here. I'm not aware that there is such a good team elsewhere. And if you're a bit pragmatic, that's the way we should go.
Well, Mr. Lamy, thank you so much for your time. This has been very interesting.
Good. Happy to have done that for you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.